The day I won the lottery started like any other, dull and gray, the sun barely scraping over the rooftops of our small suburban street. I was sipping my morning coffee, the bitter liquid clinging to my tongue, when the email pinged, a digital tremor of excitement impossible to ignore. I blinked at the numbers, double-checked them, and then a wave of disbelief hit me. I had actually done it. Millions. Enough to erase all the mundane worries, the bills stacking up like cruel reminders of a life half-lived. I barely noticed my son, Alex, hovering in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the kitchen floor. He said nothing, just watched, that strange half-smile flickering on his face. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was happy for me. Maybe he just wanted a piece of this new fortune. The morning was electric. I called my wife, letting her scream into the phone while I sank into the leather of my recliner, the sound of her joy echoing through the walls. Then I poured myself a celebratory drink, a simple whiskey. Neat. I clinked the glass against the rim of my imagination, savoring the warmth sliding down my throat, imagining a life where money was no longer a chain. Alex appeared behind me, startling with his quiet presence. He leaned casually against the counter, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He said, "Congratulations, Dad." It sounded hollow, rehearsed almost. A flicker of unease crawled up my spine, but I pushed it down. This was my day, my windfall. Later I decided to make a toast. 2 glasses, whiskey poured with care, the amber liquid catching the morning light like molten gold. I handed one to Alex, smiling, and raised mine. But something in his expression didn't sit right. I caught the way his hand lingered near the rim, the slight twitch, the quick glance around the kitchen. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to believe it, but instinct, that ancient part of me wired to survival, screamed that something was off. When I left the room for just a moment, it happened. Alex reached for my glass. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but I saw it. My heart stopped. I froze in the doorway, silent as a shadow. I watched him, my son, slip something into my drink, something meant for me. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. I felt the cold creep along my spine, the sound of the whiskey pouring into the glass, the faint clink as it touched the ice, became deafening. My mind raced, heart hammering, every instinct screaming danger. I moved quickly, a quiet, calculated motion, swapping the glasses, pretending nothing had happened, pretending I was still unaware. My hands didn't shake, but the rage simmering beneath my skin burned hotter than I could contain. Alex turned back, unaware, and I smiled, a calm mask over the storm building inside me. I realized then that winning the lottery didn't just change my bank account. It changed everything around me. The trust, the facade of family, the very air in the house. Nothing would ever be the same. And as I sipped the switched glass, tasting the whiskey I now knew was safe, I understood one thing clearly. This was no longer just about money. This was about survival, about exposing the truth, about seeing who Alex really was when the stakes were high. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease, the kind that settles into your chest like lead. I tried to act normal, laughed when Alex cracked jokes, nodded when my wife recounted trivial errands, but every movement, every glance, felt like a trap I had to navigate. The house, which usually smelled faintly of coffee and laundry, seemed suffocatingly still, carrying an undertone I couldn't name. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the subtle slip of his fingers, the almost imperceptible tilt of my glass, and it made my stomach churn. By afternoon, the world outside seemed to mock me. The sun was high and harsh, slashing through the blinds and creating sharp lines across the living room floor. I paced, the soles of my shoes scraping against the hardwood, a rhythm to steady my nerves. I had won the lottery, yet the prize felt poisoned. Wealth that should have been freedom had become a weapon in Alex's hands, and the thought of what he might have done made my pulse spike. I remembered the stories I'd heard as a kid, whispers of betrayal in families, siblings scheming for inheritance, fathers undone by their own children, and yet, seeing it unfold with my son, my own flesh and blood, felt unreal. I forced myself to breathe slowly, in and out, letting the cold autumn air from the open window fill my lungs, but the knot in my chest remained. I decided to test him, quietly, casually. I mentioned needing another drink and gestured toward the bar cart in the corner. Alex didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched, calm, almost calculating, his eyes unreadable. I poured my own glass first, swirling the amber liquid like it held the answers. Then, with deliberate slowness, I reached for the other glass, pretending to sip from it before casually swapping them again. He didn't notice. Either he was unaware, which seemed impossible, or he thought he had the upper hand. Either way, the game had begun. Dinner was tense. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs filled the dining room, but I could barely focus on the food. Every time Alex passed the bread basket or reached for the salad, my mind screamed warnings. I observed him, noting the small tells, the tap of his fingers against the table, the brief flicker of a smirk when he thought I wasn't looking. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. I realized then that Alex had always been clever, smarter than I had given him credit for, but now that intelligence felt dangerous. I excused myself halfway through the meal, claiming a sudden headache, and retreated to the study. The quiet of the room was both a relief and a torment. I poured myself another glass of whiskey and sat by the window staring out at the quiet street. Neighbors' children played, oblivious to the storm brewing inside our house, the cruel twist of human nature quietly unfolding under the roof they thought was safe. I remembered the lottery ticket sitting on the counter, the winning numbers still printed in bold black ink. A symbol of fortune, yes, but also a symbol of everything that could go wrong. I realized that from the moment I hit check, my life had shifted into a new orbit. It wasn't just about riches anymore. It was about trust, deception, and survival. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. Alex walked into the study, his casual demeanor a mask I was learning to peel away. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, eyes studying me like a predator sizing up prey. "Dad," he said finally, his voice deceptively calm, "you're acting different today." I forced a laugh, a hollow sound that barely echoed in the room. "Maybe I am," I said. "Maybe winning changes a man. You ever think about that?" He shrugged. "I guess so. But you've always been a little rigid. Maybe now you can loosen up a bit." There it was, the subtle challenge, the bait. I felt a chill crawl over my skin. He thought he could manipulate me with casual words, that he could keep me guessing, that I wouldn't notice. But I did notice. I always notice. I leaned back in the chair, swirling the whiskey in my glass, tasting the warmth, the faint burn that reminded me life was fleeting and fragile. "You know, Alex," I said, slowly, carefully, "life isn't just about games, not even clever ones." He looked at me, puzzled for a fraction of a second before masking it. The moment passed like a shadow, but I felt it. The silent acknowledgement that he knew something had changed, that I wasn't just a man who won the lottery anymore. I was a man who had caught the shadow in his own home, a man who would see it through to the end. And in that moment I realized that wealth, power, and betrayal were only part of the story. The real battle had begun, not over money, but over trust, family, and survival. And I intended to win. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the house wrapped in a ghostly quiet that felt unnatural. Even the creak of the floorboards seemed distant, muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stayed in bed for a few moments, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog outside, and the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Every instinct screamed that yesterday was only the beginning. Breakfast was a tense ritual. I moved deliberately, pouring coffee into 2 mugs as if nothing had changed, the steam curling up in lazy spirals that smelled faintly of caramel and roasted beans. Alex sat across from me, leaning back, eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the rim of his cup. I caught the subtle twitch of his fingers and remembered the glass. I could feel the pulse of anger and fear mixing in my veins, a dangerous cocktail that made my hands shake just enough for him not to notice. I decided I needed more information. I couldn't confront him blindly. The stakes were too high. I watched him closely as he buttered his toast, listening to the rhythm of his movements, the faint click of the knife against the plate. Every detail mattered. I noticed how he paused for a fraction of a second before taking a bite, how his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't watching. The boy I had raised, the son I had trusted, was no longer entirely my own. He was something else, something calculating. After breakfast, I made an excuse to leave the house. I needed space to think, to clear the fog of panic, and begin planning. I walked down the quiet streets of our neighborhood, the autumn air crisp in my lungs, smelling faintly of damp leaves and gasoline from passing cars. The normalcy of it all felt like a cruel joke. The world was going on around me, indifferent, oblivious to the storm that had begun within my home. I stopped at a small coffee shop a few blocks away, the kind of place with old wooden tables and the faint smell of cinnamon in the air. I ordered a cup and sat in a corner, watching people move in and out, their lives seemingly ordinary, predictable. I envied them for a moment. They didn't know what it was to look at your own child and realize he might be willing to harm you for money. They didn't know the sting of betrayal that cuts sharper than any blade. I replayed the scene over and over in my mind, testing scenarios, imagining conversations, measuring reactions. Alex hadn't been careless. He had been subtle, precise. That meant he had thought this through. That meant he wasn't just a child caught in greed. He was a threat. When I returned home, the tension inside the house had thickened like fog. My wife was in the garden, humming softly as she pruned roses. I could feel Alex's eyes on me from the kitchen doorway, silent, watching, calculating. I decided it was time to act, but carefully. The first step was observation. I had to understand the full scope before moving. I started small, a casual comment about my drinks, careful phrasing, watching his reaction. He answered with practiced nonchalance, but I noticed the way his jaw tightened for a split second. That split second told me more than words ever could. I was learning his language now, the subtle cues, the involuntary tells, and he would learn mine soon enough. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the living room carpet. I paced again, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Every step I took was measured, every breath considered. I couldn't afford a mistake. This wasn't just about the lottery anymore. It was about family, survival, and trust. And trust, I realized, might be the most dangerous game of all. Dinner was even more tense than the day before. The roasted chicken on the table smelled inviting, but I barely touched it. My mind was elsewhere, plotting, analyzing, calculating. Alex moved around like a shadow, quiet, calm, but I knew better. I watched every move, every expression, every subtle gesture. He was skilled, but so was I. And I had the one thing he didn't: experience, patience, and the resolve to protect myself at all costs. After dinner, I retreated again, this time to my private study, the space where I could think clearly. I poured a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light, and sat at my desk. I ran scenarios through my mind, noting potential weaknesses, possible traps, and strategies. I realized something chilling. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my wife, not because she would betray me, but because this was a fight that Alex had already begun, and I had to anticipate every angle. And as night fell, the house settling into uneasy silence, I made a decision. I would watch, wait, and gather evidence. Every movement, every word, every expression mattered. Alex had crossed a line, and I knew the path forward would be treacherous. But I also knew this: I was ready. I wouldn't be caught off guard again. I wouldn't let him get away with this. For the first time since the lottery ticket had changed our lives, I felt a grim satisfaction. The game had begun, and I was no longer just a victim. I was a player, and I intended to win. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The sunlight spilling across the bedroom floor felt less like a promise and more like a countdown. Every second in that house carried weight now. Every interaction, a test. Alex didn't know it yet, but I had started playing a game he wasn't ready for. I moved quietly through the kitchen, noting the ordinary details with heightened awareness. The small scratches on the counter, the smudge of fingerprints on the faucet, the way the morning paper bent slightly under the weight of someone's careless hand. Each little thing told a story, a narrative of who was in control, and I was learning to read it. I decided to start the day with a casual, calculated test. I poured my coffee into 2 identical mugs, one for myself and one for Alex. I pretended to fumble, dropped a sugar packet near his mug, and watched him. He didn't touch it, didn't react beyond a subtle tightening of his jaw. That tiny gesture told me everything. He remembered yesterday, or at least felt the weight of it, and he was cautious now. Breakfast was silent except for the scraping of silverware against plates. I could smell the eggs and bacon, but my appetite had vanished, replaced by a tense vigilance. I noticed how Alex moved, how his eyes flicked toward mine when he thought I wasn't looking. The man I thought I knew, the son I had trusted, wasn't the same boy who used to spill milk at the table. He had learned to mask, to conceal, to calculate. After breakfast, I went to the study, pretending to read some paperwork, but my mind was elsewhere. I needed proof, evidence of what he was capable of. I couldn't confront him on suspicion alone. I needed something tangible. The thought of cameras crossed my mind, but I dismissed it as too obvious. I needed subtlety, precision, and patience. Hours passed in a tense rhythm, punctuated by the occasional sound of Alex moving around the house. I imagined him plotting, waiting, calculating the perfect moment to strike. And in that imagining, I felt a thrill. I realized I had underestimated him, and in underestimating him, I had underestimated myself. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to act more directly. I invited Alex into the living room under the pretense of discussing some minor home repairs, a task that would keep us in close proximity. I watched him as he approached, noting the way he held himself, the casual tilt of his head, the way his fingers brushed against the furniture. Every movement was a clue. I made small talk, careful, casual, observing his reactions. And then I left a glass on the coffee table, an identical glass to the one from yesterday, with a faint trace of water and a drop of whiskey. I didn't need to sip it. I just wanted to see. The moment I looked away, Alex's eyes flicked toward it, a micro-expression that lasted only a heartbeat. But it was enough. I had him. The realization hit me then. Alex was bold, but not invincible. He had planned carefully, but he hadn't accounted for my vigilance, my experience, my ability to notice the small things that others overlooked. He assumed he was in control, but he was still playing in my arena. That evening, I made another subtle move. I rearranged the cups again, placing them where only I could reach them, and I watched him from a distance. I saw him glance at the glasses, hesitate, then move on. The hesitation was a crack, a small flaw in his confidence, and I would exploit it. Dinner was tense, the aroma of roasted chicken and fresh bread filling the air, but my mind was sharp, alert, focused. I watched every motion, every glance, every twitch. Alex tried to engage me in conversation, testing me, probing, but I deflected smoothly, answering just enough to keep up the appearance of normalcy while keeping my mind several steps ahead. After dinner, I retreated to the study again, but this time with a sense of clarity and strategy. I started planning in detail, contingencies, traps, and subtle countermeasures. Alex had crossed a line, but I wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. The lottery had changed everything, yes, but it had also awakened something else, a determination to protect myself, to assert control, and to expose the truth. By the time night fell, I was calm, resolute. I poured a final glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light like fire in a jar. The house was quiet now, shadows stretching across the walls. I thought of Alex upstairs, unaware that his father was no longer the man he had underestimated. I thought of the game that had begun yesterday, and I realized one undeniable truth. I was ready to fight, and I would win. The night stretched on like a taut wire, every creak of the house echoing in my ears. I sat at my study desk, whiskey in hand, replaying every detail from the past 2 days. I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Alex had crossed a line, and I needed proof, tangible evidence that he wasn't just careless or ambitious, but willing to harm me for money. The thought churned in my gut like acid, sharp and bitter. I decided to start small, quietly examining his movements around the house. I observed him from behind a half-open door as he moved through the kitchen, the way his hands lingered near the cabinets where my medication was kept. My pulse quickened. That was it, that small hesitation, the way he tilted his head and studied the bottles. the way his fingers brushed over the labels as if calculating doses. It was the proof I had needed. He had been plotting more than just yesterday's glass. I remembered the lottery ticket, the numbers still in my wallet. Millions could be gone, siphoned from me in ways I hadn't imagined. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control, trust, and survival. Alex had underestimated me. I would make sure he would never underestimate me again. I started checking everything he touched, quietly noting what he moved and where. The house, normally a place of comfort, had become a chessboard, every object a potential move in a dangerous game. I swapped cups, hid bottles, shifted items from one place to another, all subtle, almost imperceptible. And I watched him. Every glance, every hesitation, every flicker of expression told a story. That evening, I made a calculated move. I left a glass of water with a faint trace of bitter almond extract, enough to trigger a reaction, nothing more, on the counter. I didn't need him to drink it. I just wanted to watch, to see his response. Alex paused, hand hovering above the glass, a micro-expression of hesitation flashing across his face. It was subtle, but it was there. He recognized danger, and in that recognition, I found satisfaction. I began piecing together a plan. I needed a trap that was undeniable, something that would reveal his intent without risking my life. I went through the house, examining every corner, every potential weak point. I thought about cameras, hidden cameras, recording devices, anything that would let me catch him in the act. My mind raced, mapping possibilities, calculating probabilities. Sleep came only in fragments that night, each one haunted by the image of him slipping something into a drink or reaching for my medication. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down, heavier than any fear or anger I had ever known. But I also felt a spark, a sense of clarity and determination. I had the upper hand now. I just needed to prove it. The next morning, I enacted the first part of my strategy. I pretended to leave the house, locking the door behind me, and then returned quietly through the garage, a side entrance Alex didn't know I monitored. I watched him from the shadows as he moved through the living room, his movements deliberate, controlled. He didn't notice me, but I noticed everything. Every subtle twitch, every glance toward the kitchen, every moment of hesitation. Later that day, I confronted him. Not openly, not yet, but with subtle comments. I mentioned needing to check on my health, casually noting that I had started new supplements. I watched his reaction. His eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, a brief tightening of the jaw. He knew. And I knew he knew I knew. By evening, I had set my final piece. I swapped the remaining glasses and placed them in positions that only I could reach. I moved medications, making it impossible for him to touch anything without me noticing. Every movement, every step, was a test, and he failed small ones, hesitated at harmless objects, revealing the cracks in his composure. As I poured a glass of whiskey and sat back in the dim light, I realized something crucial. The battle had shifted. It was no longer a subtle test of trust. It was a confrontation of wits, patience, and resolve. Alex had made his move, but I was ready. I had the knowledge, the foresight, and the control. And soon, he would have to face the consequences of his ambition. I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. The lottery had brought danger, yes, but it had also awakened something far more powerful. My own cunning, my patience, my ability to anticipate and outmaneuver. Alex had underestimated me, and he would pay for it. Tonight I would sleep lightly, dream carefully, and prepare for the next day. The trap was set, and the game was far from over. But one thing was certain. I was no longer vulnerable. I was ready to reclaim control, and I would. The morning light was sharper than usual, slicing through the blinds like a warning. I woke early, senses alert, every nerve humming with anticipation. The house was quiet, deceptively quiet, and I knew Alex was already awake somewhere, plotting, waiting, calculating. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle into my chest, masking the tension that had gripped me since yesterday. I spent the morning observing him without interacting. He moved through the kitchen with precision, measuring his steps, his hands lingering over objects, pausing at the cabinets where my medications were stored. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of anticipation. I had been waiting for this. The first real opportunity to catch him in the act. I decided to test him directly, but subtly. I placed 2 glasses on the counter, one with water, one with a faintly bitter trace of something harmless but attention-grabbing. Then I left the room, pretending to be busy with paperwork. From the hallway I watched. Alex approached slowly, his eyes scanning the glasses. He picked up the one I had traced, hesitated, and then set it down again. My stomach tightened. He knew something was off, but he couldn't be sure. That hesitation was proof, subtle, but undeniable. He had planned, yes, but my precautions had forced doubt into him. Doubt was dangerous. It made even the cleverest minds falter. I continued observing as he moved to the cabinets. He lingered, fingers brushing against bottles, pausing at the prescription pills I had carefully rearranged. My heart beat faster. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. A single misstep, and I would know everything. He paused again, eyes darting toward the study, toward me. I could almost hear his mind racing, the calculations he had made, the contingencies he had prepared, and then he withdrew his hand. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension ebb slightly. He hadn't succeeded yet, but he had tried, and now I had the upper hand. I decided it was time to escalate. I couldn't wait any longer for him to make a critical mistake. I called him into the living room under the pretense of discussing a family matter. He entered cautiously, aware, alert, and I could feel the weight of his wariness like a tangible force in the air between us. I spoke casually, deliberately, about the lottery winnings, about the changes they brought, about trust. I watched his eyes, every flicker, every micro-expression. And then, almost casually, I mentioned the glasses, the medications, the careful steps I had taken to protect myself. His reaction was subtle but immediate. His fingers tightened into fists for a brief moment, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he masked it. The realization hit him, and I could see it. He knew I knew. The balance had shifted, and I had cornered him without a word of accusation, without a confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable, electric, almost suffocating. I sipped my whiskey slowly, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of anticipation. Later, I retreated to the study, planning my next move. I needed undeniable proof, something concrete, something that could expose him without relying on assumptions. I thought about recording devices, subtle traps, ways to catch him in a moment of overconfidence. Every detail mattered. Every movement had to be accounted for. The day passed in a tense rhythm, each minute stretching longer than the last. Alex moved through the house with calculated caution, but I noticed his micro-failures, the small pauses, the glances toward the study, the tightening of his jaw. He was clever, yes, but even the cleverest make mistakes under pressure. By evening, I had set the stage. I arranged the glasses, the medications, and even the placement of furniture in ways that gave me full visibility. Every step he took, every glance he made, was observable. I had transformed the house into a controlled environment, a chessboard where I moved pieces invisibly, forcing him into positions he couldn't fully control. And as night fell, I sat in the study, whiskey in hand, staring at the dimly lit room. I felt a grim satisfaction. The trap was ready. Alex was clever, calculating, dangerous, but I was ready. I had patience, strategy, and the determination to protect myself. The game was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the balance shifting. The predator had become the prey, and soon, Alex would learn that some lines, once crossed, cannot be ignored. The house felt different that morning, as if it too sensed the shift in power. I woke before dawn, every muscle coiled and alert. Even the usual creaks of the floorboards sounded sharper, more deliberate. The quiet was not peaceful. It was anticipatory, charged with a tension that pressed against my chest. I drank my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, letting it settle as I planned my day with meticulous attention. Every movement, every word, every glance I made had to be calculated. Alex was clever, yes, but he had not accounted for a father who had suddenly become vigilant, patient, and unyielding. Breakfast was tense, the usual smells of bacon and toast failing to bring any comfort. I observed him closely, noting the small details that betrayed his caution. The way he avoided my gaze when he reached for the sugar, the slight hesitation in his hand as he poured his coffee, the subtle twitch of his fingers as he fumbled with his toast. These micro-failures, barely perceptible, were the cracks in the armor of his composure. I allowed myself a silent nod. Patience. Observation. This was a game of precision. After breakfast, I devised a new strategy. It wasn't enough to watch. I needed to provoke him subtly, to create a situation where his intentions would reveal themselves without him realizing it. I arranged the glasses carefully, placed the medications in positions that drew his eye, and subtly shifted the furniture to control the angles from which I could observe him. Every element of the house became part of my plan. It was no longer just a home. It was a controlled environment, a stage for a confrontation I intended to orchestrate with precision. I left for a short walk, under the pretense of clearing my head, but really to observe from a distance. Windows and mirrors became my tools. From across the street I saw Alex moving inside, the way he paused at the counter, the way his eyes flicked toward the study where I had left a small recording device hidden among books. He was aware of something. He always was, but he couldn't pinpoint it. That hesitation, that brief moment of doubt, was enough. It confirmed my suspicions. He had planned more than just yesterday's slip, more than just a momentary test. Returning home, I moved deliberately, every step calculated, every gesture casual. I prepared the living room for the next phase, placing the glasses within easy reach, ensuring the line of sight from the study gave me a perfect view. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat, pretending to read a magazine, letting the calm mask the storm that had been building inside me for days. I could feel Alex's presence in the room without seeing him. The subtle shift of air as he walked past, the faint creak of the floorboards, the slight adjustment in the light as he moved toward the counter. It all spoke to me. I decided to speak carefully. "Alex," I said, my voice casual, "have you been paying attention to the new arrangements in the kitchen?" My words were innocent on the surface, a mere question about furniture placement, but the effect was immediate. His hand froze mid-motion, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew I was testing him, and he hesitated. A mistake, a micro-failure that gave me a window into his intentions. The afternoon stretched long and tense. Every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture became a part of my observation. I noted the way his fingers lingered near the glass I had subtly traced, the way his gaze flicked toward the hidden recording device before darting away. He was trying to assess me, to determine if I suspected him. But the trap I had laid was subtle and invisible. Every instinct, every careful observation had prepared me for this exact moment. By evening, the tension had reached its peak. I prepared dinner with deliberate slowness, the smells of roasted chicken and fresh bread filling the air, but I barely noticed them. My focus was on Alex, the way he moved, the way he responded to the slightest cues. I had arranged everything to create pressure, to provoke a reveal without confrontation. And it worked. He reached for the glass I had traced, hesitated, and I saw it. A flicker of panic, subtle, brief, but unmistakable. His plan, whatever it had been, was beginning to unravel. My patience, my careful observations, my calculated interventions had forced him to betray his own intentions. I allowed a faint smile, hidden behind the mask of casual calm. This was the moment I had been preparing for. After dinner, I retreated to the study once more, reviewing the recordings. Every hesitation, every subtle expression, every movement of Alex's hands had been captured. The proof was undeniable. He had planned, he had schemed, and now he was exposed. Not with accusations, not with confrontation, but with evidence that spoke louder than any words could. I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. The game had shifted irrevocably in my favor. Alex was clever, yes, but he had underestimated me. He had failed to account for my vigilance, my strategy, my patience. And soon, the truth would emerge in a way that he could not deny. As night fell, I sat in the dim light, sipping my whiskey, the tension of the day slowly giving way to a sense of control. I had survived the first rounds, I had observed and collected evidence, and I had maintained the upper hand. The trap was set, the pieces in place, and the confrontation, when it came, would be unavoidable. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would win. The house was tense the next morning, suffused with a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Even the sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed sharp, almost accusatory, as if it were highlighting every shadow, every corner where deception could hide. I woke early, alert, every muscle coiled, every sense focused. The day ahead was critical. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was time to escalate, to apply pressure, to force Alex into revealing more of himself. Breakfast was a controlled ritual. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, the clink of cutlery and the aroma of eggs and bacon masking the storm of calculation running through my mind. Alex joined me, pretending casualness, but I could see through it. His eyes flicked toward the glasses, lingering just a fraction too long. His hand hesitated over the sugar jar. The smallest tells gave away the weight of his thoughts, his careful calculation. I made no sudden movements, no accusatory remarks. Just let him reveal himself in micro moments. Everyone a small victory. I decided to introduce a subtle, but undeniable test. I poured 2 glasses of water, one with a faint, harmless taste I knew he would notice if he attempted to tamper with it. I placed them on the counter in plain view and left the room, returning moments later to casually pretend I hadn't noticed anything. He approached, hesitated, and then quickly stepped away. That hesitation, that slight flinch, confirmed everything. He had been planning more than just a single act of betrayal. He had been thinking ahead, considering contingencies, and he was now aware he was being watched. It was time to confront him without fully revealing my hand. I called him into the living room under the pretense of discussing routine matters, anything that required him to be nearby. He entered cautiously, aware, the faint tension in his posture betraying his internal calculation. I gestured for him to sit, my own movements calm, deliberate, masking the storm beneath. "You know," I said slowly, my voice casual but precise, "these past few days have been revealing. I've noticed things, subtle patterns, small movements, and hesitations. Things that suggest you've been thinking beyond what you should." I watched him closely. His fingers twitched slightly, a brief tightening of the jaw. He had realized, finally, that I had not been naive, that I had been observing, analyzing, and preparing. He attempted to mask his reaction with a casual shrug, but I caught it, the way his eyes darted toward the study, toward the recording device I had placed among books, toward the glasses I had traced. He had underestimated me, and now the evidence of his calculation was beginning to reveal itself. I took a slow sip of whiskey, letting the warmth slide down my throat, focusing my mind. "Alex, I've always trusted you. I've always believed in your judgment. But some lines, some boundaries, should never be crossed, no matter the temptation." I let the words linger, watching him, observing every micro-expression, every tiny shift in posture. He had planned, yes, but he hadn't accounted for my patience, my ability to wait for the right moment. For the first time since the incident with the glass, I felt a shift in the dynamic between us. I was no longer reacting. I was initiating, subtly directing the flow of the conversation and the tension in the room. He leaned back, carefully calculating his response, but I could see the cracks forming, the fear, the uncertainty, the doubt. I had injected it into him without a single accusation. I continued cautiously, deliberately. "I've realized something else too," I said, letting a slow pause follow. "Life has a way of testing us in unexpected ways, and sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can hurt us the most." His eyes flicked away for just a fraction of a second, a momentary lapse that revealed the internal struggle. I could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind, weighing risk against reward, planning contingencies, realizing too late that I had anticipated his every move. The afternoon passed in a tense rhythm. I observed him, deliberately leaving opportunities for him to act, all while maintaining the appearance of casual normalcy. I watched him approach the cabinets where my medications were kept, pause, and then retreat. I had created the perfect environment to reveal intention without confrontation. His hesitations, small though they were, spoke volumes. The trap had worked. By evening, I had collected enough to be certain. I knew Alex's ambition, his calculation, and his willingness to betray. But more importantly, I had revealed it to him subtly, without ever raising my voice or making a direct accusation. I had shifted the power balance, and he knew it. The quiet satisfaction that settled over me was a mix of relief and anticipation. As night fell, I poured a glass of whiskey and sat in the dimly lit study, reviewing the events of the day. The game had moved from observation to subtle confrontation. I had forced him to reveal cracks in his armor, to hesitate in ways that proved intent without explicit proof yet. The psychological edge was mine, and I intended to use it. Tomorrow, I knew, would be decisive. The next step would bring us closer to a confrontation that could no longer be avoided, and I would be ready. Alex had underestimated me, and he would pay for it, not with anger or revenge, but with the inevitability of truth. I was in control, and soon he would have nowhere left to hide. The next morning, the tension in the house felt like a physical presence, pressing down on me, on Alex, on every corner of the rooms. I woke before dawn, the silence around me thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My senses were razor sharp. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint shuffle of movement, every whisper of air was a clue, a signal, a warning. I drank my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, letting it steady me while my mind raced with strategy. Today would not be about testing or observation. Today would be decisive. I began by preparing the environment with care. The glasses were arranged deliberately on the kitchen counter, each one marked in a way only I could detect. The medications were placed under my careful supervision, each bottle slightly shifted to indicate their real position, leaving no room for error. Subtlety would be my ally, precision, my weapon. I moved through the house quietly, leaving hints of normalcy while laying the groundwork for the inevitable confrontation. Alex was already awake, and I felt his presence in the living room even before I entered. I poured another cup of coffee, careful to make no sudden movements, and observed him from the doorway. He sat with his hands folded, eyes scanning the room, every gesture calculated. The faint tension in his posture, the quick dart of his eyes toward the glasses, the slight twitch of his fingers, all of it was visible, if one knew where to look. And I did. I had spent days learning to read him like a book, every page revealing intent, desire, and fear. Breakfast passed in a tense rhythm. The smells of eggs, bacon, and coffee usually comforted me, but today they felt like background noise to a far more important symphony of observation. I noted every hesitation, every flicker of expression. Alex reached for the butter, paused, then slowly moved it back. I could see the gears turning in his mind. He wanted to act, but he had learned that I was always one step ahead. That hesitation, that split second of doubt, was the first crack in his armor. By mid-morning, I had put my plan into motion. I invited Alex into the study, ostensibly to discuss a mundane household matter. The room was carefully arranged so that everything he touched could be observed. Everything he did would reveal his intentions. I remained calm, casual, letting him feel a false sense of control while subtly guiding him toward the trap I had laid. "You know, Alex," I began, my voice calm but deliberate, "it's interesting how certain things reveal themselves over time. Patterns, habits, decisions made without much thought. They speak volumes about a person's character." I let the words hang in the air. His eyes flickered, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. He was calculating, assessing. He thought he could read me, but now he was the one under observation. I moved slowly to the cabinet, where I had hidden a small camera among the medication bottles. The device was tiny, nearly invisible, but perfectly positioned to catch any attempt at tampering. I gestured to the counter casually, leaving a glass of water in plain sight. My hands were steady, my demeanor relaxed, masking the tension coiled within me like a spring. Alex approached the counter, his movements careful, deliberate. Every step was measured. I could almost hear his internal monologue, the calculations, the contingencies, the rationalizations. He reached for the glass, hesitated, then withdrew. I let a faint smile cross my face, hidden behind calm eyes. The hesitation was confirmation. He was planning, yes, but my trap was working. The evidence was beginning to accumulate. I allowed the conversation to continue, letting him think he had regained some control. I asked casual questions about his day, about plans for the weekend, watching his responses, noting the micro-expressions, the fleeting signs of nervousness. He was clever, yes, but he could not conceal everything, and today, he would leave a trail that I could not ignore. By afternoon, the pressure was nearly unbearable. I had created a controlled environment where every action, every glance, every hesitation would reveal intent. The subtle placement of objects, the positioning of the hidden camera, and the psychological manipulation of attention had forced Alex into a corner. I could feel it in his movements, the way his hands lingered too long on certain objects, the way his gaze flickered toward areas he knew were under scrutiny. Dinner was the final stage of the day's strategy. I prepared the table with deliberate care, the aroma of roasted chicken and bread filling the air, masking the undercurrent of tension. I left a glass deliberately within his reach, marked subtly as I had done with the others. Every detail was a test, every action an opportunity for him to reveal himself. And finally, it happened. He reached for the glass, hesitated, and then, unable to resist, he touched it. The camera captured the movement perfectly, recording the subtle intent behind the gesture. I did not move, did not speak. I watched calmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. The trap had worked. Later in the study, I reviewed the footage. Every hesitation, every micro-expression, every calculated motion was there. The evidence was undeniable. Alex had crossed a line, and I now had proof. The balance had shifted irrevocably. He had been clever, yes, but he had underestimated patience, vigilance, and the resolve of a father who had been betrayed. As night fell, I felt a grim satisfaction. The first steps toward confrontation had succeeded. The trap had been set, the evidence collected, and the truth would soon emerge. Alex had revealed himself unwittingly, and I was ready to face him with certainty. The game was far from over, but now I held the decisive advantage. The next morning, the house was heavy with anticipation. I woke early, the sunlight weak and filtered, cutting through the blinds in pale streaks that seemed almost accusatory. The tension was palpable, not just between Alex and me, but in the very air itself. I could feel it pressing down on my shoulders as I sipped my coffee, every sense alert, every muscle coiled. Today was no longer about testing, observing, or laying subtle traps. Today was about confrontation, direct, undeniable, and decisive. I called Alex into the study after breakfast, choosing my words carefully. My voice was calm, casual even, but underneath, it carried the weight of someone who had spent days calculating, observing, and preparing. "Alex," I said, gesturing toward a chair, "we need to talk." The simplicity of the statement belied the storm brewing beneath it. His eyes flickered, a micro-expression of tension passing across his face before he masked it. He sat cautiously, aware that something was coming, aware that he was no longer in control. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the amber liquid catch the light, the warmth a comfort against the tightness in my chest. "Over the past few days," I began slowly, letting each word land, "I've noticed patterns, hesitation, and subtle actions that suggest intentions far beyond what a father should fear from his son." I paused, letting the silence stretch, giving the weight of my words time to settle. Alex didn't speak. He didn't need to. The tension in his posture, the flicker in his eyes, the brief tightening of his jaw, all of it spoke volumes. I reached for the laptop on my desk and brought up the footage I had carefully collected over the past week. Every small hesitation, every deliberate movement toward the glasses or the medications, every micro-expression of calculation was recorded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I simply let the evidence play, each frame exposing the truth. Alex's eyes widened, almost imperceptibly at first, then more obviously, as the reality of his actions became undeniable. "You see, Alex," I said quietly, keeping my tone measured, "this isn't about suspicion anymore. It's about fact. You've crossed a line that should never be crossed, And the evidence is clear. The intentions, the planning, all of it is here. I let the laptop sit open between us, the glow of the screen illuminating the tension etched into his features. He tried to speak, to offer an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. I had anticipated this reaction. I had spent days understanding not just what he might do, but how he might respond when confronted. He was clever, yes, but now he faced the consequences of underestimating me. His silence said more than words ever could. Fear, realization, and the faintest glimmer of guilt. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my whiskey again, letting the calm mask the storm that had built inside me. "Alex," I continued, softer now, but no less firm, "I raised you to be better than this. I believed in your judgment, your character, but you've made a choice, and choices have consequences." I let the words sink in, watching his eyes flicker, the subtle shift of tension in his shoulders. He understood, finally, the gravity of what he had attempted. For the first time since the incident with the glass, I felt a strange sense of relief. The fear, the uncertainty, the tension, it was giving way to clarity. The confrontation wasn't about anger or punishment anymore. It was about truth, about exposing reality, about reclaiming control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond simple money or greed. Alex shifted in his seat, finally finding a voice. Quiet, hesitant. "Dad, I didn't think you'd notice. I thought I could handle it." His words trailed off, the shame and fear evident. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak, knowing that in his confession lay the resolution I had been waiting for. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight in my chest lighten just slightly. "You underestimated me," I said, voice firm but calm. "And that was your first mistake. But you also have the chance to make your next choice the right one. You can face the truth, accept responsibility, and start repairing the damage. Or you can continue down this path, and you already know where that leads." The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken understanding. Alex's eyes dropped, gaze fixed on the floor. The tension remained, but now it was tempered by the undeniable presence of reality. The trap had been set, the evidence laid bare, and the confrontation had shifted the dynamic irreversibly. I rose from my chair, the movement deliberate, commanding. I walked toward him slowly, placing a hand on his shoulder, firm, but not aggressive. "It doesn't have to end like this, Alex," I said softly, almost tenderly. "You've made mistakes, yes, but it's never too late to do the right thing, to be better than your worst intentions. That choice, that's yours." For the first time, I saw genuine fear mixed with regret in his eyes. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and for a fleeting moment I felt a fragile connection. The son I had raised, facing the consequences of his own choices, beginning to understand the weight of his actions. The room was quiet, the laptop still open, the evidence undeniable. The confrontation had been subtle but effective, exposing truth without violence, revealing intent without threat. And as I poured another glass of whiskey, I realized the most important part had been achieved. The psychological advantage had shifted irrevocably. Alex had been forced to confront reality, and the path forward, however difficult, was now clear. Tonight I would rest with a sense of accomplishment. Tomorrow would bring decisions, discussions, perhaps reconciliation. But the crucial turning point had been reached. The trap had worked, the confrontation had succeeded, and the balance of control had been reclaimed. And in that quiet satisfaction, I understood that winning wasn't about money or manipulation. It was about truth, patience, and the ability to see beyond immediate intentions. And I had won. The morning after the confrontation was heavy with quiet. The house felt almost sacred, a space suspended between what had been and what could be. I woke early, as I had every day since the lottery win, but this time there was a subtle difference. The tension was still present, but it carried a new weight, possibility. Possibility for understanding, for acknowledgement, for something resembling peace. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, the steam curling lazily into the air, and watched Alex move quietly about the house. There were no tricks, no calculated hesitations, just the tentative, careful movements of a son who knew he had been seen and caught, and who was beginning to face the consequences. I decided to approach him gently, The confrontation yesterday had been necessary, but I realized that if this story was to end well, it needed more than evidence and warnings. It needed dialogue, honesty, and a measure of humility from both of us. I cleared my throat and called him into the living room. He appeared within moments, slow and deliberate, as if each step measured the path toward trust. His gaze met mine, and for the first time, there was no flicker of defiance, only a mixture of guilt, hesitation, and an almost imperceptible longing for approval. I gestured for him to sit, keeping my own posture relaxed, casual, and non-threatening. "Alex," I began carefully, "we've seen each other at our worst these past few days, and I've seen the truth about what you were willing to do." My voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of experience and disappointment. He nodded slightly, not interrupting, absorbing the gravity of my words. "I want you to understand something important," I continued, letting the silence hang between us for a heartbeat. "Mistakes, betrayals, they can't be erased, but they can be acknowledged. They can be faced. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is look at yourself in the mirror and admit that you've done something wrong." I watched his hands, folded tightly in his lap, his knuckles pale. He was listening, really listening. "I made mistakes too," I said, softening slightly, letting a hint of vulnerability show. "I raised you as best I could, but I wasn't perfect. I worked too much. I focused too much on the life I thought was right, and maybe I missed things that mattered to you. But that doesn't excuse what you did. What you tried to do? That was your choice, and it's something you have to live with." His eyes dropped to the floor, a single nod acknowledging the truth of my words. We sat in silence for several minutes, the quiet punctuated only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. I let him absorb the weight of the past week, the choices we had both made, the emotions we had both held inside. The house no longer felt like a battlefield but a space for reckoning, for understanding, and perhaps for healing. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice quiet, hesitant. "Dad, I was wrong. I didn't think about what I was doing. I let greed blind me. I thought I could control it, that you wouldn't notice, that it would all work out. But I see now how wrong I was." His words came haltingly, each one heavy with remorse. I nodded, letting him continue, knowing that this admission was the first step toward reconciliation. "I'm sorry," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for the lottery, but for the trust I broke, for the things I didn't see in you, in us." There was a vulnerability in his tone that I hadn't heard before, a softness that replaced the calculation and defiance of previous days. I felt a swell of something deep inside me, a mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of whiskey, and met his gaze steadily. "Alex, what you did was serious, yes, but what matters now is what we do next. You have a choice, to continue down the path that leads to regret, or to make amends, to rebuild, to show that you can be better." He swallowed hard, nodding, the weight of understanding settling over him. We spoke for hours, the conversation ebbing and flowing like a river. We explored the mistakes, the misunderstandings, the moments when our actions had hurt each other. I listened to his perspective, and he listened to mine. The air in the room began to change, lighter, not entirely free of tension, but filled with the possibility of connection. Each acknowledgement, each confession, acted like a small stitch, mending the tear in the fabric of our relationship. By evening, we had reached a tentative understanding. Alex admitted fully the calculations he had made, the intentions he had harbored, and the fear and shame that now accompanied the truth. I admitted my own failings, my preoccupation with work, my inability to see beyond my routines and obligations. In that shared honesty, the first true bridge between us began to form. As night fell, we remained in the living room, the glow from the lamp casting warm shadows across the walls. I poured us both a glass of whiskey, not for ritual, not for pretense, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the work we had begun. He raised his glass slightly, and I mirrored the gesture. A simple toast, but one filled with meaning, acknowledgement, regret, and the tentative first step toward trust. I realized then that winning the lottery, the confrontation, the tests and traps, it had all led to this moment. The real victory wasn't in money or manipulation. It was in clarity, in understanding, in the slow rebuilding of a bond that had been strained, almost broken, but not beyond repair. "Tomorrow," I said finally, voice calm, "we start over. Not as if nothing happened, but with the truth between us. That's how we move forward." Alex nodded, a small but genuine gesture, the first spark of redemption in his eyes. And for the first time in a week, I felt the house exhale, as if it too recognized the shift, the beginning of healing, of trust slowly returning. We sat together long into the night, sipping whiskey, speaking softly, sharing memories, regrets, and tentative hopes. And in that quiet, fragile peace, I understood that even after betrayal, after fear, after near disaster, there was still room for reconciliation, growth, and connection. The lottery had changed everything, yes, but it had also given us a chance to see the truth, face it, and emerge stronger, together. The morning sun spilled into the house with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. I woke earlier than usual, but for the first time since the lottery win, I did not feel tension coiled like a spring in my chest. Instead, there was a quiet sense of purpose, a subtle peace, as if the air itself had shifted. The confrontation, the traps, the tension, all of it had led to this moment, the beginning of something more enduring than wealth or fear. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, taking in the familiar smells of coffee and toast, the faint scent of the roses my wife tended to in the garden. Each detail felt sharper, more vivid, a reminder that life itself was fragile and precious. Alex emerged from his room soon after, his posture less guarded, his gaze steadier. There was a new humility in him, a quiet acknowledgement of the past week's mistakes, and a willingness to face the consequences. We shared breakfast together, the silence comfortable rather than tense. The eggs, the bacon, the steaming cups of coffee, all ordinary elements of an ordinary morning, but somehow they felt significant, like markers of a life reclaimed. Alex spoke first, quietly, hesitating before each word, yet sincere. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I did, about what I tried. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to lose us or myself over greed or recklessness." His eyes met mine, steady now, open in a way that hadn't been possible before. I nodded slowly, taking in his words, savoring the honesty that had been absent for too long. "Alex, everyone makes mistakes," I said carefully, letting the warmth of my voice carry reassurance. "What matters is what you do after. You've admitted it. You've faced the truth. Now comes the part where we rebuild, together." I could see the weight of relief passing over him, a subtle loosening of the tension that had gripped him for days. We spent the morning talking, not about money, not about the lottery, not about manipulation or suspicion, but about us, about family, about trust and understanding. Alex shared his fears, the insecurities that had driven him to act rashly, and I shared mine, the failings in my attention and care that had created gaps between us. Each confession, each acknowledgement, acted like a bridge, slowly spanning the chasm that had opened between father and son. By midday, I realized that the house itself had changed. The quiet no longer felt oppressive, the shadows no longer threatening. The sunlight that spilled across the floor seemed almost celebratory, highlighting the simple pleasures of a life reclaimed. Laughter, conversation, and the renewed connection between parent and child. I suggested we take a walk outside, and Alex agreed, his steps lighter than I had seen in weeks. We strolled through the neighborhood, the autumn air crisp and invigorating, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant smoke from chimneys. Each step felt like a fresh start, a shedding of past fears and grievances. I watched Alex observe his surroundings, noticing the small details, commenting on things he hadn't paid attention to before. There was a sense of presence in him, an appreciation for life that had been buried under ambition and recklessness. As we walked, we spoke about the future. The lottery, which had once felt like both a blessing and a curse, now seemed like a tool, a resource to be used wisely rather than a weapon to divide us. Alex expressed a desire to make amends in tangible ways, supporting causes he had neglected, investing responsibly, and taking small steps to restore his integrity. I listened, offering guidance, reassurance, and the lessons I had learned through the years. Returning home, the afternoon stretched into evening. I suggested we sit together in the living room, not to discuss past mistakes, but to simply be. Alex nodded, and we settled into the worn couches, a sense of comfort replacing the lingering tension. The house was quiet, but this time it was the quiet of understanding, of peace slowly taking root. I poured us both a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light like molten gold. To mistakes, I said lightly, raising my glass, and to learning from them. Alex smiled faintly, his hand steady as he mirrored the gesture. To learning, he agreed. The simple act, small as it seemed, carried a weight far greater than any words could capture. It was a recognition of growth, responsibility, and renewed trust. We spent the evening sharing memories, some humorous, some tender, some filled with lessons learned the hard way. I realized how little time we had spent like this in recent years, truly present with one another. The lottery, the betrayal, the tension, all of it had forced a reckoning, but it had also created a space for something deeper, understanding, empathy, and a chance to rebuild our bond on a foundation of honesty and respect. As night fell, the house was calm, almost serene. I reflected on the past week, the fear, the tension, the confrontation, and now, the fragile reconciliation. The lottery had been a catalyst, yes, but the real transformation had been in us, in our willingness to face difficult truths, admit mistakes, and take responsibility for our actions. Alex turned to me, his expression open, almost tentative. "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing me, even when I didn't deserve it." The words hit me with a force I hadn't anticipated. I felt the weight of my own failures, my own regrets, but also a profound sense of accomplishment and pride. I nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Alex, I'll always see you. Always." And now, we move forward together. The night grew quiet around us, the soft glow of lamps illuminating the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of wind through the trees. I realized that peace, like trust, was fragile and required care, attention, and patience. But it was possible. And tonight, I felt it. I sat back, taking a final sip of whiskey, savoring the warmth that spread through me. The lottery had changed our lives, but in the end, it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the lessons, the confrontation, the admissions, and the willingness to forgive and rebuild. Alex had faced his mistakes, I had faced mine, and together we had begun the slow process of healing. As I watched him relax into the chair beside me, I understood that the real victory wasn't in wealth, manipulation, or revenge. It was in clarity, honesty, and connection. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, enduring sense of peace, knowing that we had survived the storm and that a new chapter of our lives, one filled with trust, understanding, and hope, was beginning.